On the morning of my 31st birthday, 3 days after I transferred exactly $82,450 into our joint escrow account, I watched my husband hand a velvet ring box to my younger cousin across a restaurant table, like he was passing her a secret. He didn't know I was sitting 12 feet away behind a fake ficus tree, holding a receipt that proved the money inside that ring had come straight out of the house deposit I'd spent 6 years saving. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that you never even thought to check your bank statements, tell me in the comments, because that blind trust is exactly how this story begins. My name is Natalie Brooks. I was 31, living in Phoenix, Arizona, and at the time, I worked as a pool maintenance technician. Not glamorous, not impressive. But it paid $27 an hour, and I took every overtime shift I could get under the desert sun. Because I had one dream: to buy my own house. Not our house, mine. I grew up moving between cheap apartments with a mother who believed stability was something rich people talked about. By the time I turned 18, I promised myself I would never again live somewhere that someone else could take away. So for 6 years, I saved everything. No vacations, no designer clothes, no eating out unless it was Taco Tuesday. Every dollar had a purpose. And when I finally reached $82,450, the amount needed for a 10% down payment on a modest 3-bedroom house in Mesa, I cried alone in my truck after work. Not from happiness, from relief, because I thought I had finally made it to safety. That's when Daniel Carter Brooks, my husband of 2 years, convinced me to put the deposit into a joint escrow account for convenience. He said it with that soft voice he used whenever he wanted something. It'll make the closing process smoother, Nat. The bank likes seeing both spouses on record. I hesitated, but Daniel had never given me a reason not to trust him, at least not one I understood at the time. He worked as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, earning about $95,000 a year. He was charming, well-spoken, and knew exactly how to say the right thing at the right moment. He was also very good at making me feel like I was being unreasonable whenever I asked questions about money. "You're too defensive about finances," he once told me. "Marriage means partnership." So I transferred the deposit into the joint account, and 3 days later, I saw him buying a diamond ring from my cousin, Olivia Mae Whitman. Olivia was 26, blonde, polished, and always just a little too interested in my life. She had a way of hugging you while scanning the room behind your shoulder, like she was constantly looking for something better. I hadn't seen her in months, not since she moved back to Phoenix after a messy breakup she never explained, which, in hindsight, should have been my first warning. But the moment I saw Daniel slide that ring box across the table toward her, I didn't feel shocked. I felt cold. The kind of cold that happens when your brain switches from emotion to calculation, because something didn't add up. That ring wasn't cheap. Even from a distance, I could tell it was at least 2 carats. Princess cut, platinum band. I knew exactly what that cost. Between $18,000 and $25,000. And Daniel had told me just last week that he couldn't contribute to the house deposit because his quarterly bonus hadn't come through yet. So where did the money come from? I already knew the answer. I just needed proof. I left the restaurant without confronting them, without crying, without making a scene. Because I had learned something important growing up broke. Explosions give people time to prepare defenses. Silence gives you time to gather weapons. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I logged into our joint escrow account for the first time since transferring the deposit. There were 3 transactions I didn't recognize. $22,800. Jewelers District PHX. $4,200. Private dining reservation service, $1,150. Boutique hotel downtown. Total missing, $28,150. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I just stared at the numbers and felt something inside me shift permanently. Because this wasn't just cheating. This was theft. And in Arizona, taking marital funds without consent for personal use could legally qualify as financial fraud. But here's the part that made my stomach twist. The escrow account required 2-step verification for withdrawals, which meant Daniel had accessed my phone while I was at work. He'd approved the transfers using my authentication code. He hadn't just betrayed me. He'd planned it carefully, deliberately, like I was someone he needed to outsmart. That realization hurt more than the affair itself, because affairs can be impulsive. This was calculated, and calculations always leave trails. So I did something Daniel never expected. I didn't confront him. I didn't call Olivia. I didn't even mention the missing money. Instead, I walked into work the next morning, clocked in at 6:02 a.m., cleaned 3 pools, and spent my lunch break calling a real estate attorney. Because if someone steals your future, you don't scream. You secure your evidence. And the attorney said something that changed everything. Natalie, if this money was traceable to your personal savings before marriage, or provable separate contributions, you may have more leverage than you think. Leverage, not justice, not revenge. Leverage. And that's when I realized something even worse than the missing money. Daniel hadn't just taken my deposit. He'd unknowingly handed me the first piece of something much bigger. Because when I pulled the full transaction history, I found another withdrawal, one that didn't match any purchase. $9,000 transferred to an account under a name I didn't recognize. An account opened 2 months before Olivia even moved back to Phoenix. And that was the moment I understood. Their relationship hadn't just started. It had been going on far longer than anyone in my family could imagine. 2 weeks before Christmas, exactly 47 days before our scheduled closing date, I sat in my truck outside a Bank of America branch, holding a printed statement that showed a $9,000 transfer to an account under the name M. Carter Holdings, LLC. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was calculating how long Daniel Carter Brooks had been lying to me, and how much of my life had been quietly redirected without my knowledge. If you've ever discovered a lie so deep it rewrote your past in seconds, tell me in the comments, because that moment, right there in that parking lot, was when I realized this wasn't just an affair. It was a long-term operation, and I had been the funding source. The name on the transfer didn't belong to Daniel, at least not directly, but the middle name gave it away. Carter. Daniel's legal name was Daniel Carter Brooks. He'd always said Carter was his mother's maiden name, which meant one of 2 things. Either someone in his family owned that LLC, or he did and had hidden it. I went back through every bank statement from the last 12 months, because once you know where to look, patterns start to scream. There were 5 smaller transfers over the past year. $1,200, $2,300, $950, $3,100, $1,750, each labeled as miscellaneous joint expenses. Each approved during hours when I was working pool routes, when my phone was often left in the truck locker. Total quietly moved over time, $9,300, before the big $9,000 transfer. Daniel hadn't just stolen my house deposit. He'd been siphoning money slowly for over a year. The realization didn't break me. It clarified something. Because predators don't usually act suddenly. They test boundaries first. And Daniel had spent months testing how much he could take before I noticed. That afternoon, I called the real estate attorney again. Her name was Karen Whitfield. Full name, Karen Elaine Whitfield. 15, voice like steel, wrapped in silk. I told her everything. The escrow withdrawals, the suspicious LLC, the jewelry purchase. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she asked one question. Before marriage, how much of the deposit money came directly from your personal earnings? All of it, I said. Every dollar. There was a pause. Then she said something that made my pulse steady for the first time in days. That changes your legal position significantly. Because in Arizona, property laws were complex, but traceable separate funds could still be protected. If I could prove that money originated solely from my premarital savings and Daniel accessed it fraudulently, it wouldn't just be a divorce issue. It could become a civil fraud case. And fraud had consequences Daniel wasn't prepared for. But Karen warned me about something else. Natalie, don't confront him yet. People like this escalate when they feel exposed. Escalate. That word stuck with me. Because Daniel had never raised his voice, never hit me, never even openly argued. His manipulation was always quiet, polite, reasonable, the kind that makes you question yourself instead of them. So I followed her advice. I stayed calm. I stayed silent. and I started watching. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed things I'd ignored before. Daniel started locking his phone at night. He took longer showers. He smiled at texts he wouldn't show me. But the biggest change? He became unusually affectionate, bringing coffee home, cooking dinner, touching my shoulder more often, like he was trying to reinforce something, or ease guilt, or both. And one night, while we were sitting on the couch, he casually asked, "You still excited about the house?" I smiled. The same soft, trusting smile I'd practiced for years. "Of course," I said. Inside, something colder answered, "Not the house. What comes after?" Because here's what Daniel didn't know. I'd already hired a forensic accountant. His name was Marcus Hilford, former IRS financial investigator. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Within 3 days, he found something that shifted the entire situation from betrayal to something far darker. M. Carter Holdings, LLC, he told me, sliding a folder across the table, is registered under your husband's name. I wasn't surprised, but the next sentence froze my breathing. And it's not new. It was created 3 years ago, 6 months before you got married. 3 years. Which meant Daniel had established a hidden financial entity before he ever proposed, before he ever moved into my apartment, before he ever started talking about building a future together. I felt something inside me snap into place, because that timeline meant one thing. The deception wasn't opportunistic. It was premeditated. And then Marcus opened the folder to the next page. Inside were payment records, multiple transactions. Not just from our joint account, but from 2 other women's accounts over the past 3 years. Smaller amounts, similar patterns, each labeled under consulting payments, each traced back to personal transfers. I stared at the names. Women I didn't know, but the pattern was unmistakable. Daniel hadn't just stolen from me. He had a system, a rotating cycle of relationships and financial extraction. And suddenly, a question hit me so hard, I had to sit down. Was I his wife, or just his biggest investment? Because one of the women listed had the same last name as Olivia, Whitman. And the payment history showed something even more chilling. The transfers connected to Olivia's name had started almost 2 years ago, which meant the affair with my cousin didn't begin after she moved back to Phoenix. It had been happening while she was still living in another state, while she was attending family holidays, while she sat across from me at Thanksgiving, smiling. And that's when I realized something I still wish I hadn't learned. This wasn't just a cheating husband. This wasn't just a toxic cousin. This was a coordinated betrayal that had been unfolding quietly inside my own family for years. And the deeper Marcus dug, the more it became clear that the diamond ring purchase wasn't the biggest financial move Daniel had made recently. Because 2 weeks earlier, he'd filed paperwork to transfer ownership of something far more valuable, something tied directly to my name. 10 days before New Year's Eve, exactly 62 days after I wired $82,450 into the escrow account, I sat across from the forensic accountant as he slid a certified copy of a property transfer form toward me, and I saw my own name typed on a document I had never signed. At the bottom of the page was a digital authorization timestamp, 7:18 p.m. on a Tuesday night when I was scrubbing algae out of a client's pool filter system, 30 miles away from any computer. If you've ever discovered someone tried to legally move something under your name without your knowledge, tell me in the comments. Because what I felt in that moment wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you finally understand the full shape of a threat. The document was titled Preliminary Title Adjustment and Beneficiary Designation. Legal language, dry, technical, but the meaning was simple. Daniel Carter Brooks had attempted to add himself as a secondary beneficiary on a separate financial asset listed under my sole ownership. An asset that wasn't connected to the house deposit, an asset I had never told him about, which meant only one thing. He hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been investigating me, carefully, quietly, for a long time. I stared at the form for a full minute before asking the question that mattered most. How did he even find this? Marcus Hilford didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned another page in the folder. This one showed a digital login log, access timestamps, IP addresses. and one entry circled in red. A login to my personal retirement account portal, using my credentials. Date, 8 months ago. Location, our home Wi-Fi network. Time, 2:13 a.m. I was asleep that night. I remembered because I'd worked a double shift and passed out on the couch. Daniel had carried me to bed, kissed my forehead, and apparently, once I was unconscious, he had used my fingerprint to unlock my phone, reset my account passwords, and explored every financial account I had. Not impulsively, not emotionally, strategically, like someone auditing a target. My stomach didn't drop, it hardened. Because this wasn't betrayal born from weakness. It was predation, built on patience. And suddenly, memories I'd once dismissed started rearranging themselves into something ugly and precise. The way Daniel had insisted on handling taxes every year. The way he asked casual questions about my savings whenever I got overtime bonuses. The way he once joked, laughing lightly. "You're more financially disciplined than most investment clients I know." At the time, I thought it was admiration. Now, I understood. He wasn't admiring me. He was profiling me. And then Marcus said something that made the air feel thinner. This isn't just about adding himself as beneficiary. He also initiated a draft request to take a secured loan against your retirement account. Loan. The word echoed in my skull. "How much?" I asked quietly. Marcus tapped the page. $65,000. Nearly my entire retirement balance. And because retirement accounts had different authorization rules, Daniel hadn't completed the transaction yet. But the request was active, pending additional verification, which meant if I hadn't discovered this, he could have completed it within weeks, quietly, legally appearing legitimate. And I would only notice when it was too late to reverse. That realization hit differently than the affair, because cheating is emotional violence, but financial sabotage, that's survival violence. That's someone trying to control your future, your independence, your ability to leave. I looked at Marcus. How many people do this? He didn't soften his answer. More than you'd think. Usually, it escalates gradually. First access, then small transfers. Then, structural control. Structural control. That phrase stuck with me because suddenly I saw the entire pattern. The joint account, the hidden LLC, the siphoned funds, the attempted beneficiary change, the pending retirement loan. Daniel wasn't just stealing money. He was trying to build a financial cage around me, one quiet transaction at a time. And then something else hit me. Something colder. If he'd been doing this for years, why now? Why escalate suddenly? Why risk withdrawing such a large amount from escrow? Marcus seemed to anticipate the question. He slid one final document toward me. This one wasn't financial. It was a business registry filing. And when I saw the date, I understood everything. Files, 3 weeks ago. M. Carter Holdings, LLC. Asset Acquisition Notice. Purpose listed. Intent to purchase residential property. My heart didn't race, it slowed. Because the address listed under pending acquisition was familiar. Too familiar. It was the exact address of the house I was supposed to close on in 47 days. The same 3-bedroom home in Mesa. The same one I'd spent 6 years saving for. Daniel hadn't just stolen part of my deposit. He was planning to use my stolen money to buy the house under his LLC without me legally separating the property from our marriage before I even realized it. So when closing day came, the house wouldn't belong to us. It would belong to his hidden company. And I would have zero legal claim. That was the moment the final illusion shattered. This wasn't a cheating husband who made bad decisions. This was a long-term financial predator who had married me as an investment strategy. And the coldest part? He probably believed I would never understand the paperwork well enough to catch him. For the first time since discovering the affair, I allowed myself to feel something close to anger. Not explosive anger. Focused anger. The kind that sharpens your thinking instead of clouding it. Because Daniel had spent years quietly studying my weaknesses. But he'd made one mistake. He underestimated my patience. And he underestimated how dangerous silence can become when it belongs to someone who finally sees the whole game. That night, when I came home, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, smiling, scrolling through his phone. He looked up like nothing in the world was wrong. "Hey," he said warmly. I was just texting Olivia. She might come to the family New Year's party. Olivia. The name didn't sting anymore. It felt informative, like a clue. I nodded calmly and walked past him, because suddenly I realized something important. They weren't hiding anymore. They were getting comfortable. And comfortable people make mistakes, especially when they believe the person they're betraying still doesn't know the truth. But as I walked into the bedroom, I noticed something small that Daniel clearly hadn't expected me to see. His laptop was open on the desk, screen still awake, and on it was an email draft addressed to someone named Olivia W. Subject line: after the closing, everything changes. 3 nights before New Year's Eve, at exactly 11:42 p.m., while fireworks were already echoing from early celebrations across Phoenix, I stood in our dark bedroom reading an email draft on my husband's open laptop that outlined a plan to remove me from my own future within the next 45 days. The last line of that message read, "Once the property transfers to the LLC, Natalie won't have any legal leverage left." If you've ever discovered someone calmly planning your downfall while still smiling at you every morning, tell me in the comments, because the most terrifying betrayals don't happen in anger. They happen in quiet, practical sentences. The email wasn't emotional. There were no declarations of love, no apologies, just logistics. Daniel Carter Brooks had written it like a business update. Bullet points, timelines, action steps. Finalize escrow withdrawals before January 10th. Ensure Natalie remains unaware of beneficiary adjustments. Prepare Olivia for cohabitation transition after closing. Cohabitation transition. I stared at that phrase for a long time because it didn't say affair. It didn't say relationship. It said transition. Like I was a tenant being quietly phased out of a property lease. And then I saw the most chilling part. At the bottom of the draft was an attachment labeled Financial Recovery Plan. Recovery. Not theft, not fraud. Recovery. He genuinely believed he was reclaiming something that belonged to him. I clicked the file. Inside was a spreadsheet, columns showing projected financial scenarios. One column labeled Scenario A, divorce before closing. Another, Scenario B, divorce after property secured. The numbers were brutally clear. If he divorced me before the house purchase, he'd owe me part of the joint assets. But if he secured the house under the LLC first, then divorced me after, he would walk away with the property intact, and I would leave with almost nothing. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a financial ambush. And suddenly, every small conversation we'd had over the past year felt different. The way he'd discouraged me from keeping my savings separate, the way he'd pushed for joint accounts, the way he'd framed financial independence as lack of trust. He wasn't building a marriage. He was building a trap. I closed the laptop carefully, left everything exactly as it was, and walked into the bathroom to breathe, because something inside me had shifted again. The sadness was gone. Even the anger was fading. What replaced it was something colder. Resolve. Not revenge for emotional pain. Protection of survival. Because this wasn't about love anymore. It was about control, and I wasn't going to let him keep mine. The next morning, I called Karen Whitfield before sunrise. She listened silently as I described the email. Then she asked one precise question. "Do you have a copy?" "Yes." "Good," she said, "because that changes the entire legal strategy." She explained something I hadn't fully realized. In Arizona, secretly transferring marital funds into an entity designed to deprive a spouse of rightful property could constitute fraudulent conveyance, not just in divorce court, in civil court, which meant potential penalties far beyond asset division, financial damages, legal sanctions, even criminal investigation, depending on intent. Daniel hadn't just crossed a line. He'd created a documented paper trail proving intent to deceive. But Karen warned me again. Don't confront him yet. He's in the escalation phase. Escalation. The word echoed again. Because people who operate like Daniel don't retreat when exposed. They double down. They tighten control. And sometimes they become dangerous in ways that aren't immediately obvious. So instead of confronting him, I started preparing something else. Distance. I quietly opened a new checking account in my name only, redirected my paychecks, changed all digital passwords, and rented a small storage unit across town. Not for furniture, for documents, birth certificate, social security records, employment contracts. Every piece of identity that could become leverage if someone wanted to trap me financially. Because Karen had said something else during our call. Financial predators don't just steal money. They try to isolate their target's ability to recover. Isolation. That word stayed with me. Because suddenly, I noticed how Daniel had slowly separated me from support systems over the years, encouraging me to cut back on visiting friends, discouraging me from discussing finances with family, framing privacy as loyalty. At the time, it felt like intimacy. Now, I understood. It was containment. And that realization hurt in a deeper way than the affair, because it meant parts of my loneliness weren't accidental. They were engineered. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. My cousin, Olivia Whitman, texted me directly for the first time in months. "Hey Nat, can we grab coffee tomorrow? Miss you. Miss you." The words looked almost surreal on the screen, because now I knew exactly what she and Daniel had been planning behind those polite messages. I stared at the text for a long time, not feeling rage, feeling curiosity, because predators often reveal more when they believe their prey is unaware. So I replied simply, "Sure, what time?" She answered immediately, 11 a.m. Same cafe we used to go to in college. Same cafe. The familiarity felt almost cruel, like she was deliberately invoking shared memories to maintain control of the narrative. But I agreed. Because this wasn't about confrontation. It was about information. And something inside me sensed this meeting would reveal more than she intended. The next day, when I walked into the cafe, Olivia was already there, smiling. Perfectly styled. Diamond ring flashing on her finger under the overhead lights. The same ring Daniel had bought using my stolen deposit. She hugged me tightly, like nothing in the world had changed. Like she hadn't been secretly planning to move into my future home. And then, before I even sat down, she said something that confirmed just how deep this betrayal really went. "Natalie, I think it's time we talk about what Daniel deserves, after everything he's been through with you." 5 days before New Year's Eve, at exactly 11:07 a.m., while the cafe's espresso machine screamed loud enough to cover half our conversation, my cousin, Olivia May Whitman, leaned forward across a small marble table and told me my husband had been emotionally suffering for 18 months because of me. She said it calmly, like she was delivering a diagnosis, not an accusation. If you've ever sat across from someone who betrayed you and watched them genuinely believe they were the victim, tell me in the comments. Because nothing distorts reality more than someone rewriting your story while you're still living inside it. I didn't react right away. I just stirred my coffee, slowly. Because Olivia kept talking when she thought she had control, and I needed her to keep talking. "Natalie," she said softly, lowering her voice like we were sharing something intimate. "Daniel feels like he's always had to carry the emotional weight in your marriage." Carry. The word almost made me laugh. Because for 6 years before I even met Daniel, I'd carried 2 jobs, student debt, and every bill in my own life, without help from anyone. But I didn't interrupt. Olivia's eyes searched my face, trying to gauge how much I knew. What she saw must have reassured her, because she leaned in further. "He told me you've been distant," she continued, "focused only on money, on work, on control." Control. That word again. But now I understood something crucial. This wasn't just an affair narrative. It was a justification narrative. They weren't just betraying me. They were rewriting me so they could feel morally clean while taking everything I'd built. I took a slow sip of coffee. "Is that what he told you?" I asked quietly. She nodded, relieved I wasn't arguing. "Yes, he said you don't really need him anymore, that you've become emotionally unavailable." Emotionally unavailable. I let the phrase settle in the air, because it revealed something important. Daniel wasn't framing his actions as greed. He was framing them as necessity. Like stealing from me was a response to emotional neglect. That realization clarified something I hadn't fully seen before. This wasn't just about money. It was about narrative control. Because if they could convince themselves and others that I was cold, controlling, and selfish, then what they were doing wouldn't look like exploitation. It would look like escape. And then Olivia said something that made the entire situation shift into an even darker clarity. You know he's been supporting me financially since my breakup, right? I blinked once. Not in surprise, in confirmation, because Marcus's financial report had already shown those transfers. But I needed to hear her explain it. How long? I asked calmly. She hesitated just a fraction, then answered, almost 2 years. 2 years. Which meant their relationship had overlapped with almost our entire marriage. And she didn't even sound ashamed. She sounded justified, like she was describing something reasonable. He told me you would never understand, she added softly, because you only measure life in dollars. For a moment, I just looked at her. Really looked. The polished nails, the diamond ring, the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the future was already secured. And I realized something deeply unsettling. Olivia didn't see herself as a villain. She saw herself as the rightful replacement, the person Daniel should have been with all along. And that belief made her far more dangerous than someone acting out of guilt. Because guilt creates hesitation. Entitlement creates boldness. I leaned back slightly. Olivia, I said evenly, do you know where the money for that ring came from? She smiled faintly. Yes, from Daniel's bonus, he told me. There it was. The clean narrative, the one that protected her conscience. I nodded slowly and asked the question that mattered most. Did he also tell you about the house? Her eyes flickered for the first time. A tiny crack. Yes, she said cautiously. He said once everything is finalized, we can start fresh. We, not he, not they. We. She truly believed she was stepping into a future that had already been secured. And that's when I asked the question that shifted the entire energy at the table. Did he tell you whose money is funding that house? Silence. For the first time since the conversation began, Olivia didn't answer immediately. Her gaze dropped to the table. Then, back up. Daniel said, it's complicated, she replied carefully. Complicated. The word sounded almost fragile now, because it meant she knew there was something she wasn't being told, something she had chosen not to question too deeply. And that realization gave me a new insight. Olivia wasn't just complicit, she was selectively ignorant. She wanted the outcome, without fully confronting the reality of how it was being achieved. I didn't push further. Not yet, because this meeting wasn't about confrontation. It was about information. And Olivia had already revealed something extremely valuable without realizing it. She believed the house purchase was nearly complete, which meant Daniel must have told her a closing timeline, a specific one. So I asked, casually, when are you moving in? The question slipped out like small talk, but it landed heavily. Olivia hesitated again, then answered before she could stop herself. Mid-February. Mid-February. Exactly 2 weeks after our scheduled closing date. And that confirmed something critical. Daniel's plan wasn't theoretical. It was scheduled, structured, imminent. He had already promised her a timeline, which meant he was confident the financial transfers would succeed. Confident I wouldn't intervene. Confident I was still completely unaware. I finished my coffee slowly, then stood up. Olivia looked surprised. That's it? She asked. You're not upset? I met her gaze calmly. No, I said. Because upset would imply I was still reacting emotionally, and I wasn't anymore. I was observing. Calculate, preparing. As I walked out of the cafe, my phone buzzed with a notification. A new alert from the retirement account portal. Subject line, loan request status updated. I opened it immediately, and what I saw made my pulse drop into something cold and precise. The $65,000 loan request Daniel had initiated had just moved from pending to approved. Approval timestamp, 11:03 a.m. 4 minutes before Olivia started telling me how much Daniel deserved a fresh start. Which meant while she sat across from me smiling, Daniel had just taken the final step to access nearly my entire retirement savings. Without my consent, without my knowledge, without realizing that I had already set something in motion that would make that approval far more dangerous for him than he could possibly imagine. 2 days before New Year's Eve, at exactly 6:18 a.m., while the winter desert sky was still dark, and I was skimming leaves out of a client's pool under a floodlight, my phone buzzed with a notification that the $65,000 retirement loan had officially been dispersed into an account ending in 4427 that I had never seen before. The transfer cleared at 5:57 a.m. before most banks even opened, before Daniel woke up beside me. If you've ever realized someone tried to drain your future before sunrise while you were out working to build it, tell me in the comments, because betrayal hits differently when it's scheduled like a business transaction. I didn't panic. I didn't call him. I didn't even stop working. I finished cleaning the pool filter system, logged the service report, and drove to the next job like nothing had happened. Because by then, something inside me had already shifted into survival mode. Not emotional survival, strategic survival, the kind that requires stillness, the kind that waits for the right moment instead of reacting to the wrong one. And here was the most important detail Daniel didn't know. The moment that loan approval notification came through, I had already placed a legal freeze on all retirement disbursements the day before. Karen Whitfield had insisted on it. Think of it like a tripwire, she told me. If he attempts to move funds after the freeze request is filed, it creates clear documentation of unauthorized intent. Unauthorized intent, a phrase that would matter later, much later. Because when I logged into the account that morning, the $65,000 wasn't gone. It was suspended, locked in a holding status, pending fraud review, which meant Daniel believed he had secured the money, but in reality, he had just triggered a legal alarm system. And that difference would become critical. I didn't confront him that day. Instead, I spent my lunch break meeting Marcus Hilford again. He looked at the updated transfer logs and nodded once. "He's accelerating," Marcus said. "That usually means he's nearing the final stage of his plan." Final stage. The phrase settled heavily in my chest, because it meant Daniel wasn't just preparing quietly anymore. He was moving quickly now, pushing transactions through before I could notice, before anything could stop him, which told me something even more important. He believed time was running out. And that realization led to a question that had been growing in the back of my mind for weeks. Why now? Why this sudden urgency after years of slow, careful financial manipulation? Marcus answered before I even asked. "People escalate like this when they think they're about to lose access," he said calmly. "Or when a new dependency increases their pressure." Dependency. The word hit differently, because suddenly I remembered something Olivia had mentioned casually at the cafe. My breakup was messy. She had said it quickly, dismissively. But now I wondered, what kind of mess required Daniel to transfer thousands of dollars over 2 years? What kind of situation created financial urgency strong enough to push him into reckless moves? Marcus slid another document across the table. "I dug deeper into the LLC account activity," he said. "There's something recent you should see." It was a transaction history. And near the top, a payment made 3 weeks ago. $14,800. Law Offices of Henderson on Reed, a law firm, not related to property purchases, not related to business registration. I looked up. "Do you know what kind of law firm this is?" Marcus nodded. "Family law. Specifically, high-conflict cases involving paternity disputes and financial liability claims." The words settled slowly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Paternity disputes, financial liability. Suddenly, Olivia's timeline made a terrifying kind of sense. 2 years of financial support, a sudden move back to Phoenix, a rapid escalation in Daniel's withdrawals. And then something colder hit me, something that changed the emotional landscape completely. If Daniel was facing a paternity claim, he wasn't just planning a new future with Olivia. He was trying to shield assets from a legal obligation. And that meant the house purchase under the LLC wasn't just about cutting me out. It was about protecting property from potential child support enforcement. He wasn't just betraying me. He was running from consequences and using my money to do it. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt something close to exhaustion. Not sadness, not anger, just the weight of understanding how deeply calculated his choices had been. Because this wasn't a man caught in an emotional affair. This was a man managing multiple financial risks at once. A secret relationship, a possible child, a hidden LLC, stolen marital funds, and a timeline closing in around him. That level of complexity required one thing above all else: control. Daniel needed to control the narrative, control the money, control the timing, control me. And that was when I realized something crucial. The most dangerous moment wasn't when he started stealing. It was when he realized he was losing control. Because people like Daniel didn't explode outward. They tightened inward. They became quieter, more careful, more unpredictable. That night, when I came home, he was sitting at the kitchen counter smiling, scrolling through property listing photos. "Look," he said warmly, "I found some decor ideas for the new house." The normalcy of his tone felt surreal now, because I knew exactly what he believed, that he was days away from securing his future, that I was still unaware, that everything was proceeding according to plan. I smiled back calmly and sat beside him, because I had learned something important over the past weeks. Silence doesn't just hide pain. It creates space. Space to observe. Space to prepare. Space to let someone walk fully into their own consequences. But as Daniel stood to pour himself a drink, his phone lit up on the counter beside me. A notification preview flashed across the screen from Olivia, and the single line of text I saw before the screen went dark changed everything again. "Daniel, the doctor confirmed today. We need to talk about the timeline." On New Year's Eve morning, exactly 36 days before our scheduled closing date, I woke up at 5:12 a.m. and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum, while rereading a single message preview that had appeared on Daniel's phone the night before. The doctor confirmed today. "We need to talk about the timeline." It was sent at 9:47 p.m., 3 minutes after he'd told me he was just stepping outside to take a work call. If you've ever realized that someone's future plans don't include you, and that they've already begun rearranging their life to accommodate someone else, tell me in the comments. Because the quietest betrayals are the ones you discover while the rest of the world is celebrating something new. I didn't wake Daniel. I didn't confront him. I just sat there, letting the silence stretch long enough for something inside me to settle into its final shape. Because by that point, I understood everything that mattered. Daniel wasn't just rushing financial transfers. He was racing against a clock I hadn't fully seen before. A pregnancy timeline. A legal liability timeline. And most importantly, a control timeline. Because if Olivia was pregnant, and the law firm payment Marcus found suggested she was involved in a paternity dispute, then Daniel's urgency made perfect sense. He wasn't just securing assets for a new life. He was trying to shield them before a child support claim could attach to his income and property. And that realization changed how I viewed the entire situation. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about betrayal anymore. It was about risk management. He was treating people like financial variables, and I had simply been the most stable asset in his portfolio. Until now. I stood up quietly, poured myself coffee, and opened my notebook. Because for weeks, I had been documenting everything. Dates, transactions, behavior changes, statements, every small detail that would eventually form a timeline. Not for emotional closure, for legal clarity. Karen Whitfield had told me something that stayed with me. In cases like this, silence isn't weakness. It's evidence gathering. Evidence gathering. That phrase had become my anchor because it transformed waiting from passive suffering into active strategy. And I knew something else now. The most dangerous phase was about to begin. The phase when Daniel would sense subtle changes, when control would start slipping, when pressure from Olivia's situation would intensify. That was when people like him became unpredictable. Not violent in obvious ways, but manipulative in sharper, more desperate forms. That day, he woke up unusually cheerful, humming while making coffee, asking casual questions about my work schedule, suggesting we go to a New Year's Eve party at his friend's house later that night. On the surface, it looked normal, but now I saw the pattern clearly. He was monitoring me, checking emotional temperature, making sure I still seemed unaware. Because if I appeared calm, cooperative, and trusting, his timeline could continue uninterrupted. So I gave him exactly what he expected. Calm responses, small smiles, no confrontation, no questions. Because silence wasn't just protecting me anymore. It was protecting his sense of security. And that security would eventually make him careless. That afternoon, while Daniel was out running errands, I received a call from Karen. Her voice was steady, but more serious than usual. "The retirement account fraud review has escalated," she said. "And Natalie, there's something else you need to prepare for." My grip tightened on the phone slightly. "What?" There's a strong chance he may attempt one final large transfer before closing, she explained. When financial predators sense instability, they often make a last aggressive move to secure liquidity. Liquidity. The word felt cold and clinical because it meant converting assets into cash quickly. And if Daniel did that, it wouldn't just be the house deposit at risk. It would be anything he could still access. Joint accounts, shared credit lines, even debt he could attach to my name. Karen's next sentence was even heavier. You need to emotionally prepare for something else, too, she said quietly. When control collapses, people like this often attempt to rewrite the narrative publicly. Rewrite publicly. That meant something specific. He would try to frame himself as the victim, frame me as unstable, selfish, emotionally cold. Because if he controlled the social narrative, he could protect his reputation while securing his financial escape. And that realization didn't frighten me anymore. It clarified my next step. Because Daniel's greatest strength, his ability to shape perception, was also his greatest vulnerability. He relied on appearing reasonable, calm, trustworthy, which meant if the truth surfaced in a public setting, with evidence, with witnesses, he wouldn't explode. He would collapse. That night, we attended the New Year's Eve gathering at his friend's house. A large backyard party, string lights, music. About 40 people, normal laughter, normal conversations. And Daniel moved through the crowd exactly as he always did. Charming, relaxed, affectionate toward me in subtle ways that reinforced his image. He introduced me proudly to coworkers, wrapped an arm around my waist, kissed my temple at midnight when fireworks exploded overhead. Anyone watching would see a stable marriage, a happy couple starting a new year together. And that was when something inside me shifted into its final stage, because I realized something simple and irreversible. He wasn't afraid of hurting me. He was afraid of losing his image. And that meant the true battlefield wasn't private anymore. It was public perception. Because once the narrative changed in front of others, he would lose his most powerful shield. As midnight passed and people began counting down to the new year, Daniel leaned close and whispered something in my ear. Next year at this time, he said softly, we'll be celebrating in our new house. The word felt almost surreal now because I knew the truth behind it. But I just smiled faintly and said nothing. Because the most dangerous revenge isn't loud. It's quiet, patient, and timed perfectly. But as we were leaving the party, my phone vibrated with a new message from Marcus. Just one sentence. Emergency update. The LLC filed a fast-track property transfer request this afternoon. Fast-track. That meant Daniel wasn't waiting for the original timeline anymore. He was accelerating everything, which meant something had just changed on his end. Something that made him desperate enough to move early. And when I opened the attachment Marcus sent, I saw exactly what it was. A scanned document from Henderson and Reed law offices, dated that morning. Subject line: Notice of pending paternity claim. Immediate financial disclosure required. 4 days into the new year, exactly 32 days before our scheduled closing date, I sat inside a quiet legal conference room at 8:03 a.m., watching Karen Whitfield place a thick evidence binder on the table. The kind used not for negotiations, but for dismantling someone's credibility, piece by piece. On the front, she had labeled it in plain black text, Brooks, Daniel Carter Financial Fraud Timeline. If you've ever reached the moment where your pain stops being emotional and becomes procedural, tell me in the comments, because that's when you realize justice isn't loud. It's methodical. Karen opened the binder slowly. Inside were neatly tabbed sections: bank transfers, escrow withdrawals, LLC filings, email drafts, login records, retirement loan authorization attempts. Every action Daniel had taken over the past 3 years, now arranged into a clean, chronological sequence. Looking at it didn't make me angry anymore. It made me calm. Because chaos becomes manageable when it turns into documentation. And documentation becomes power when the right people see it. Karen tapped one section near the center. This, she said quietly, is where the case shifts from marital misconduct to potential civil fraud. It was the escrow withdrawal timeline. The exact moments Daniel accessed the two-factor authentication through my phone. time-stamped alongside my work schedule showing I was physically at client sites, which established something critical: unauthorized access with intent to conceal, not a misunderstanding, not a marital dispute. Intent. Karen flipped to another section. This is the second layer, she continued. The LLC asset transfer plan. Property acquisition under a hidden entity. Draft emails referencing his plan to remove me from ownership before divorce. Clear evidence of premeditated financial concealment. And then she turned to the newest tab, highlighted in red. Pending paternity claim, Henderson and Reed. This was the third layer, the one that explained everything. Daniel's financial acceleration, his urgency, his risk-taking. Because according to the legal notice, Olivia Mae Whitman had formally filed a claim requiring Daniel to disclose all assets, income streams, and recent transfers, which meant the house purchase under the LLC wasn't just about cutting me out. It was about hiding property before child support calculations could attach to it. He wasn't just planning a new life with her, he was already trying to protect himself from her. That realization changed how I saw the entire situation, because suddenly, Daniel wasn't in control anymore. He was trapped between two collapsing timelines. Mine and Olivia's. Karen leaned back slightly. Natalie, she said calmly, you now hold leverage on multiple fronts. Civil fraud exposure. Marital asset concealment, unauthorized financial access, potential perjury risk if he misrepresents assets during the paternity proceedings. Each layer increased his legal vulnerability. But Karen's next words were even more important. However, she said carefully, timing is everything. If you confront him too early, he could still attempt emergency asset liquidation. The last desperate move, turning everything into cash before consequences landed. Which meant I needed something stronger than private confrontation. I needed something that prevented him from rewriting the narrative, from denying intent, from shifting blame. And that meant one thing: public exposure with documented proof. But not emotional exposure, strategic exposure. Karen slid one final document toward me. Your house closing isn't just a financial event, she said. It's a legally structured public transaction involving multiple witnesses: the title company, the escrow officer, the real estate agent, bank representatives, legal documents requiring sworn declarations. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a controlled environment where statements became legally binding. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Because Daniel believed closing day was his moment of victory. The day he secured the property under the LLC, the day he locked me out of the future he'd been planning. But what he didn't realize was that same setting could become the moment his entire narrative collapsed. And unlike a private argument, he wouldn't be able to control who saw it happen. That realization didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance. Because the truth wouldn't be forced. It would simply be revealed. Over the next 3 weeks, I entered the quietest phase of my life. The phase Karen called stabilization. No confrontation. No emotional shifts. No behavior changes Daniel could detect. I continued going to work, maintaining routines, speaking calmly, responding normally. Because the most dangerous thing for someone like Daniel wasn't anger. It was silence, combined with certainty. And that silence began to affect him. I could see it in small ways. He checked my expressions more often, asked subtle probing questions, watched my reactions when finances came up, because somewhere, instinctively, he sensed control slipping, but he didn't know why. And uncertainty is more destabilizing than accusation. One evening, about 2 weeks before closing, he tried something new. He sat beside me on the couch and took my hand. Natalie, he said softly, after the house closes, maybe we should consider a fresh start. Just us. The words sounded sincere, almost vulnerable, but now I understood what they really meant. He wasn't offering reconciliation. He was testing whether I still trusted him enough to finalize the transfer without resistance. So I squeezed his hand gently and smiled faintly. That sounds nice, I said, because sometimes the most powerful strategy isn't confrontation. It's letting someone walk fully into the consequences they created. And Daniel walked deeper into his plan with growing confidence. He finalized escrow paperwork, scheduled the closing appointment, coordinated with the LLC filing attorney, believing everything was proceeding exactly as he intended. But what he didn't know was that Karen had quietly filed one final legal safeguard 2 days earlier. A motion that would only activate at a specific moment. A motion that would prevent any property transfer from completing. The instant certain evidence was presented, and as closing day approached, I realized something that changed how I felt about everything. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was containment. Because Daniel wasn't just losing a house. He was about to lose control of the narrative he'd built for years. And people like him don't fear punishment most. They fear exposure. But the night before closing, something unexpected happened. Something that showed just how desperate he had become. At 10:46 p.m., while I was brushing my teeth, Daniel walked into the bathroom holding his phone and said something that told me he had just received news that shattered his timeline completely. "Natalie," he said slowly, watching my face. "Olivia's lawyer just moved the paternity case to an emergency hearing." The night before the closing, at exactly 10:46 p.m., while I was standing at the bathroom sink rinsing toothpaste from my mouth, Daniel Carter Brooks leaned against the doorframe and told me Olivia's lawyer had just forced an emergency court hearing scheduled for the same morning as our property transfer. He said it casually, like it was an inconvenience, not a crisis. If you've ever watched someone try to stay calm while their carefully constructed life starts collapsing in real time, tell me in the comments, because the first cracks always show in their timing, not their words. I dried my hands slowly. "What does that mean?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "It's just procedural," he said. "They're requesting accelerated financial disclosure." Financial disclosure. The phrase hung in the air because I knew exactly what that meant. It meant he would have to legally declare all assets, all accounts, all transfers, all property ownership interests under oath. And if anything didn't match documented records, he could face perjury charges. I nodded calmly. "That sounds stressful," I said. He watched my face carefully, looking for signs of suspicion, fear, anger, but I gave him none. Because by that point, my role was simple. Stay steady. Let him keep believing control was still possible. Daniel exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. "It just complicates timing," he added. "But everything will still work out." Timing. That word again. Because getting the house secured before financial disclosure, locking assets before legal obligations attached to them. But now, his timelines were colliding. Closing at 9 a.m. And he could no longer fully control either one. That realization made him subtly different that night. More restless, checking his phone repeatedly, walking back and forth through the house, like a chess player watching two boards at once, both starting to go wrong. I went to bed early, not because I was tired, but because I needed the stillness. Because tomorrow wasn't just closing day, it was convergence day. The day when every hidden layer would intersect. Financial fraud, property concealment, unauthorized access, paternity disclosure, all of it would collide in one place. And for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply. Because uncertainty was gone, only execution remained. The next morning, I woke at 5:30 a.m. The sky outside still dark, the house silent. Daniel was already up, dressed in a navy suit, sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing documents. He looked composed, but there was a tightness around his mouth I had never seen before. He smiled when I walked in. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded calmly. Yes, one word, no emotion. Because by now, I understood something essential. Control isn't about speaking loudly. It's about choosing when not to speak at all. We drove to the title company office in separate cars. That had been Daniel's suggestion. Just in case schedules change after closing, he'd said. At the time, he probably thought it was practical. Now, I understood. He was preparing for rapid separation. After the property transfer, he had no intention of going home with me. And that realization didn't hurt anymore. It simply confirmed how far ahead he believed he was. The title office was quiet when I arrived. Neutral carpeting, soft fluorescent lighting, the calm, sterile environment typical of high-value transactions. Karen Whitfield was already there, sitting at the far end of the conference table. Her presence alone shifted the energy in the room. Daniel hadn't expected to see her. I could tell immediately. His smile faltered for half a second before he recovered. Natalie invited legal review, Karen said smoothly before he could ask. Standard precaution for high-value asset transfers. Daniel nodded slowly. Of course, he replied, forcing an easy tone. But the air had changed, because now the transaction wasn't private anymore. It was observed, documented, structured. Exactly the kind of environment where his usual narrative control wouldn't work. The escrow officer began reviewing documents. Routine explanations, signature instructions, verification procedures. Everything moved with calm professionalism. But I could feel Daniel's tension building, because time was running. He kept glancing at his watch, calculating, measuring how quickly he could finalize the transfer before the emergency hearing. And then the moment came. The final ownership designation form. The document that would officially transfer property rights. The escrow officer slid it toward Daniel. Please confirm the purchasing entity, she said politely. Daniel straightened slightly, confident again. Because this was the step he had planned for years. M. Carter Holdings, LLC, he said clearly. The officer nodded and reached for the corresponding ownership verification file. And that was when Karen Whitfield calmly placed her hand on the table. One moment, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it stopped everything. Daniel's head turned slowly toward her, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. Karen slid a sealed legal document across the table toward the escrow officer. Before this transfer proceeds, she said evenly, we are formally submitting a motion for immediate fraud review and asset protection injunction under Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 44-1004. The room went completely still. The escrow officer opened the document carefully, reading quickly, her expression shifting from neutral professionalism to alert seriousness. Daniel stared at Karen, then at me, his voice tight. What is this? Karen met his gaze calmly. It is documentation showing unauthorized financial transfers, fraudulent conveyance attempts, and concealed asset restructuring using marital funds, she replied. The words landed heavily, not emotional, not dramatic, just factual. And in that moment, the first visible crack appeared in Daniel Carter Brooks' composure. Because for the first time, he realized he wasn't controlling the timeline anymore. But what he still didn't know was that the next document Karen was about to present would do far more than stop the property transfer. It would force him to answer a question he had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. At exactly 9:27 a.m. on closing day, while the escrow officer was still holding Karen Whitfield's injunction notice in both hands, Daniel Carter Brooks said the first word he always used whenever his control slipped. This is a misunderstanding, he said it calmly, measured, like a man used to talking his way out of tight corners. If you've ever watched someone deny reality in real time, even while evidence sits in front of them, tell me in the comments. Because denial isn't just a reaction. For people like Daniel, it's a strategy. The room stayed silent for a moment. The escrow officer didn't respond immediately. She just placed the document carefully on the table and looked at Karen. Under Arizona procedure, she said slowly, any pending fraud injunction requires suspension of transfer until review is completed. Daniel's head snapped toward her. What? His voice was still controlled, but tighter now. Karen didn't look at him. She simply opened the evidence binder and turned to the first tab. Mr. Brooks, she said evenly, this documentation shows $28,150 withdrawn from the escrow account without Natalie Brooks' authorization. Daniel shook his head immediately. No, he said. We share that account. There it was. The first stage. Deny. Karen nodded calmly. You share access, she replied. But you access two-factor authentication using her device while she was at work, without her knowledge. She slid forward a printed timeline. Login timestamps, IP records, worksite location logs, all aligned. Daniel glanced at the page, and for a fraction of a second, his expression flickered. But he recovered quickly. That's not fraud, he said. We're married. We both benefit from the house. Benefit. The word hung awkwardly in the air, because everyone in that room now understood the contradiction. He wasn't purchasing the property under joint ownership. He was transferring it to a hidden LLC. Karen flipped to the next section. Which brings us to the second issue, she continued. The LLC registration records, filed 3 years earlier, 6 months before our marriage. The property acquisition notice. The email draft outlining his plan to secure the house before divorcing me. The escrow officer's posture changed visibly as she read, because this wasn't marital conflict anymore. It was documented intent. Daniel's jaw tightened. That email was taken out of context, he said quickly. It was just brainstorming. Brainstorming. A word people use when they're trying to make calculated planning sound harmless. Karen didn't react emotionally. She simply turned to the next tab. This is not brainstorming, she said quietly. She placed a printed copy of his spreadsheet on the table, the one labeled Scenario A, divorce before closing. Scenario B, divorce after property secured. Daniel stared at it, and this time, he didn't speak right away, because for the first time, his narrative couldn't fill the silence. There was no reinterpretation available, no softer explanation, just cold numbers showing calculated intent. The escrow officer cleared her throat. Mr. Brooks, she said carefully, these documents indicate you intended to conceal marital funds within a separate legal entity prior to dissolution. Dissolution, the legal word for divorce, and it landed like a hammer. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. This is ridiculous, he said sharply now. Natalie knew we were buying the house. He turned toward me. For the first time, his voice carried urgency. You knew this was for us. The word sounded fragile now, like something already breaking. I met his gaze calmly. No, I said quietly. I knew I was buying a house. That single sentence shifted something in the room, because it cut directly through his narrative. No accusation, no emotion, just clarity. And clarity is far harder to argue against than anger. Daniel's composure cracked further. He leaned forward, voice rising slightly. This is all being twisted, he insisted. Natalie is overreacting. She's always been paranoid about money. There it was. Stage 2, blame shifting. He was trying to reposition the story, not as fraud, but as a marital disagreement driven by my supposed emotional issues. Karen anticipated it immediately. She slid forward another document. The retirement account loan request, she said evenly. Daniel froze, because he hadn't expected that piece to surface here. This request, Karen continued, was initiated using Natalie Brooks's credentials while she was physically located at a work site. The funds were directed to an account connected to your LLC. The escrow officer's eyes widened slightly, because now the pattern was undeniable. Not one transaction. Multiple unauthorized access attempts. Systematic financial extraction. Daniel's voice dropped. You can't prove I intended fraud, he said quietly. And that was when Karen placed the final document on the table, the one that changed everything. The notice from Henderson and Reed. Mr. Brooks, she said calmly, you initiated these transfers while under legal obligation to disclose assets related to a pending paternity claim. The word paternity hit the room like a shockwave. Daniel's face went completely still. For the first time, he had no immediate response, because this was the third layer, the one he had hidden most carefully, the one that explained his urgency, the one that revealed his true motivation. Karen didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This demonstrates a clear pattern, she said quietly. You were attempting to conceal assets before mandatory disclosure. The escrow officer closed the file slowly. I am suspending this transaction immediately, she said firmly. Pending legal review. The words settled heavily in the air, because they meant something irreversible. The property transfer was frozen. The timeline Daniel had built for 3 years had just collapsed in less than 15 minutes. He stared at the table, breathing shallow now. And then came the third stage. Victim posture. He looked at me, eyes wide, voice softening. Natalie, you didn't have to do this, he said, as if I had betrayed him, as if exposing the truth was an act of cruelty. That moment revealed something deeper than anger ever could, because he genuinely believed he was the one being wronged, that losing control was injustice. But before I could respond, Karen quietly slid one final envelope toward him. This, she said, is a formal civil complaint filed this morning. Daniel's hand hovered over it, uncertain now, because he understood what it meant. Not just divorce, not just asset division, legal consequences, financial damages, potential criminal investigation. He opened it slowly. Read the first page. And the color drained completely from his face. Because for the first time, he realized something he had never prepared for. Not losing money, not losing property, but losing his ability to control the story. And just as that realization fully settled, the conference room door opened unexpectedly, and the person who stepped inside was someone Daniel had been desperately trying to avoid facing that same morning. At exactly 9:41 a.m., 14 minutes after the property transfer was suspended, the conference room door opened, and Olivia Mae Whitman walked in holding a thick legal folder against her chest, her diamond ring still flashing under the fluorescent lights. Behind her stood a tall woman in a dark gray suit. "Henderson and Reed," she said calmly. "I'm attorney Melissa Grant. If you've ever seen two carefully hidden worlds collide in a single room, tell me in the comments, because that moment, watching Daniel's face as he realized there was nowhere left to compartmentalize his lies, was when his control truly shattered. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He just stared at Olivia, like he was looking at a ghost that had stepped out of a future he thought he had fully managed. Olivia's eyes moved quickly across the table, to the escrow officer, to Karen Whitfield, to the open evidence binder, and then finally, to me. For the first time since this entire situation began, she didn't look confident. She looked uncertain. Because she hadn't known about this meeting. She hadn't known about the injunction. She hadn't known the narrative she believed was about to collapse. Her lawyer stepped forward first. "We're here to serve an emergency financial disclosure enforcement order," Melissa Grant said professionally. She placed the document on the table. "This requires Mr. Daniel Carter Brooks to immediately declare all assets, transfers, and beneficial ownership interests related to any property acquisition within the past 12 months. The timing couldn't have been more precise, because the very property Daniel had been trying to conceal was now legally required to be disclosed in front of everyone present. The air in the room felt heavy, dense, like pressure building before structural failure. Daniel finally found his voice. "This isn't necessary," he said quickly. "We can discuss this privately." Privately. The word sounded desperate now, because private conversations were where he controlled narratives, where he could reshape facts, where he could isolate people. But this wasn't private anymore. Not legally, not socially, not emotionally. Melissa Grant didn't respond to his tone. She simply said, "Mr. Brooks, failure to comply with immediate disclosure could result in contempt proceedings." Contempt. Legal language that meant consequences were no longer theoretical. They were imminent. Daniel turned toward Olivia, his voice lower now. "Olivia, you didn't have to come here," he said. And that was when the final stage began. The collapse. Because Olivia didn't soften. She didn't apologize. Instead, she looked at him with something I hadn't seen before. Clarity. "You told me the house was secure," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't angry. It was disillusioned, like someone finally seeing the structure of a lie clearly. "You said everything was handled," she continued. "That Natalie agreed to everything." Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. Because there was no narrative left that could satisfy both realities now visible in the room. He had told her one story. He had told me another. And both had now collided publicly. Karen Whitfield spoke calmly into the silence. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "you now have legal obligations in two separate proceedings, requiring full financial transparency, civil fraud, and paternity disclosure. Two timelines, two legal systems, both demanding truth simultaneously, which meant something simple and devastating. He could no longer control which version of reality people saw." Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, just slightly, but it was enough to show the shift. Because for the first time, he understood he wasn't negotiating anymore. He was responding. Melissa Grant opened Olivia's folder and removed one final document. "This," she said evenly, "is the official paternity confirmation report." She placed it on the table. Daniel stared at it without touching it, because he already knew what it said. But the presence of that document in this room, at this moment, completed the entire picture. He hadn't just been planning a new life. He had been trying to outrun responsibility, using stolen money, hidden accounts, and to build an escape route. And now, every piece of that route had collapsed simultaneously. Olivia's voice was quiet when she spoke again. "You told us." The word sounded fragile now, because it no longer meant partnership. It meant shared consequences. Daniel finally picked up the paternity report. Read it. And then something changed in his expression. Not anger, not denial, just emptiness. Because this was the moment he fully understood what he had lost. Not just the house, not just the money, but his ability to shape reality, to move between stories, to control perception. Because now the truth existed in documented form, visible to everyone. And truth doesn't negotiate. It just sits there, unmovable. I watched him quietly, not feeling triumph, not feeling satisfaction, just a deep, calm certainty. Because revenge isn't about watching someone suffer. It's about removing their ability to keep harming you. And that had already happened. Daniel finally looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. You planned this, he said. Not accusing, just stating a realization. I met his gaze steadily. No, I replied quietly. I stopped letting you plan my life. The words settled into the room like a closing statement. Because that was the real shift. Not exposure, not legal action. But the moment I stopped being part of his system, the moment I reclaimed control of my own timeline. The escrow officer cleared her throat gently. Given the injunction and disclosure orders, she said, this transaction is officially terminated. Terminated. One word. Ending 3 years of hidden manipulation. Ending a future Daniel believed was guaranteed. And as everyone began gathering their documents, I realized something quietly profound. This wasn't the end of a marriage. It was the end of a long period of invisibility. Because for years, Daniel's greatest advantage had been my silence without awareness. Now my silence existed with clarity. And clarity changes everything. But as I stood to leave the room, Karen Whitfield touched my arm gently and said something that reminded me this story wasn't fully finished yet. Natalie, she said quietly, this is only the legal collapse. She paused. There's still one more part you need to prepare for. Because what comes after someone loses control isn't always quiet. And the next phase would reveal something Daniel had been hiding, that neither Olivia nor I had fully seen coming. 6 months after the closing collapse, on a quiet Sunday morning at exactly 7:36 a.m., I stood alone in the backyard of a small beige house in Tempe, Arizona, watering a young lemon tree I had planted myself, watching sunlight slowly spill across a yard that no one could ever take from me again. The purchase price had been $314,000. The down payment came entirely from funds legally recovered through the civil judgment against Daniel Carter Brooks. If you've ever had to rebuild your life piece by piece after someone tried to dismantle it quietly, tell me in the comments. Because real healing doesn't feel dramatic. It feels calm, steady, almost ordinary. The court process after that day had been long but predictable. Once Daniel's financial records were fully disclosed under the paternity case, everything unraveled quickly. The civil fraud claim Karen Whitfield filed moved forward with overwhelming documentation, unauthorized access logs, escrow withdrawals, LLC concealment strategy, retirement loan attempt, email drafts outlining his planned divorce timing. Each piece alone might have been arguable. Together, they formed something undeniable. A pattern of intentional financial exploitation. The court didn't call it revenge. They called it fiduciary misconduct within marriage. And that distinction mattered because it meant consequences weren't emotional. They were structural. Daniel was ordered to repay the full escrow withdrawal amount, plus civil damages, plus legal fees. Total judgment, $126,480. The LLC he had created to hide assets was legally dissolved during the disclosure process. Because when financial concealment is proven, courts don't just divide property, they dismantle the mechanisms used to hide it. The retirement loan request became part of a fraud investigation review. It never resulted in criminal charges, but it permanently damaged his professional standing. His employer placed him on administrative leave within weeks of the disclosure hearings. Because financial integrity was essential in medical supply sales compliance, the reputation he had spent years carefully managing collapsed quietly. Not publicly humiliating, not explosive, just gone. And that was the real karma, not punishment. Loss of credibility. Because credibility is the currency people like Daniel rely on most. Without it, they have nothing left to leverage. As for Olivia Mae Whitman, her story unfolded differently. The paternity case confirmed Daniel was indeed the father, but the financial disclosure revealed something she hadn't expected. He wasn't financially stable. He had been funding her support using extracted funds, hidden transfers, and unsecured liabilities. Once the court established his true financial condition, her projected child support expectations changed drastically. Reality replaced the narrative she had believed, and within months, she stopped contacting him entirely, outside legal communication. I never saw her again. Not at family gatherings, not at holidays, not anywhere. Some relatives asked questions at first, but I never explained in detail because I had learned something important. You don't need to defend your boundaries to people who weren't inside your reality. Silence is sometimes the clearest statement. Daniel tried to contact me twice during the first 3 months after the judgment. Once by email, once through a mutual friend. Both times, his message carried the same tone. Not apology, not accountability, just disbelief. Like he still couldn't understand how he had lost control so completely. I never responded. Because closure doesn't come from conversations with people who only understand power. It comes from reclaiming your own. That was something I had to learn slowly. During the first few weeks after everything ended, I expected to feel victorious, relieved, triumphant. But instead, what I felt was quiet, like stepping out of a long tunnel into open air. Not dramatic, just steady breathing returning. And that's when I understood the final truth of this entire experience. The goal wasn't revenge. The goal was freedom from someone else's system. Freedom from manipulation you didn't even know was happening. Freedom from living inside someone else's narrative. Because Daniel's greatest deception hadn't been stealing money. It had been convincing me slowly that my stability depended on him, when in reality, he had depended on me all along. And once that dependency ended, so did his control. The house I bought afterward wasn't large. 2 bedrooms, a small backyard, a modest mortgage, fully in my name. No joint accounts, no shared financial access, no blurred boundaries. And for the first time in my adult life, that simplicity felt like real wealth. Because security isn't about size, it's about ownership. The lemon tree I planted in the yard had grown almost 2 feet in 6 months. Every morning when I watered it, I watched new leaves form slowly, quietly, without drama. And that growth became symbolic to me. Not fast, not flashy, just consistent. Exactly the opposite of everything Daniel's life had been built on. Sometimes people ask me what the most important lesson from all this was. It wasn't don't trust. It wasn't watch for red flags. It was something simpler. Pay attention to patterns, not words, not promises. Patterns reveal intent long before consequences appear. And once you see the pattern clearly, you don't need to fight loudly. You just need to step out of it. Because when you remove yourself from someone else's system of control, their entire structure collapses on its own. That's the part most people misunderstand about karma. It's not something you deliver. It's something that unfolds naturally once truth becomes visible. As I stood in the quiet backyard that morning, sunlight warming the air, I realized something else, too. I no longer thought about Daniel with anger, or Olivia with resentment. They had become irrelevant, like characters in a story that no longer shaped my life. And that was the real ending. Not revenge, not victory, just peace. A calm, stable life no one else could quietly rewrite. If you've ever had to rebuild after someone tried to control your future, share your experience below, because your story might help someone else recognize patterns before it's too late. And if you want to hear another story about hidden betrayal that unfolded in a completely different way, there's one I'll tell next time. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who smile quietly while planning your life behind your back.